Yeah. Oh, really? Oh.
I was sharing at the same time
Workshop.
I felt so bad.
Was there anyone on Zoom? Okay. Well, at least they're them. Oh yeah, I had this whole workshop thing. Yeah. Last day.
You don't even think about that I follow you, but you
Okay, I guess we'll call this session to order. Thank you all for your stamina, for hanging on to the very last grand finale panel, 10B. This is a panel all on the 19th century. My name is Cheryl Coulthard. I'm impersonating Jan Bang as the room chair. We have 3 presentations today. Because I took this over last minute, I'm going to ask the presenters to introduce themselves. They'll have 20 minutes each to present, and then once everyone is finished presenting, we'll take questions. So our first speaker today is going to be Mitchell Jones.
Hi. Yeah, so my name is Mitchell Jones. I'm at the moment independent historian, but I'll be starting at University of Buffalo next month. I'm from Rochester, New York, which is the birthplace of Mormonism and modern day spiritualism. I'm from the region known as the Finger Lakes. And I'm here today to talk about the Skaneateles community, which existed from 1843 to 1846. It's about 100 kilometers from the city of Skaneateles, north of the Skaneateles Lake, which is one of the Finger Lakes in Western New York, in the heart of what's known as the Burnt-Over District, or as John Humphrey Noyes, leader of the Oneida community, described it, the volcanic district of utopian socialism. Next slide, please. So the leader of the Skaneateles community was John Anderson Collins. He was an abolitionist, and he worked for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society alongside figures like William Lloyd Garrison. In July of 1840, well, so he had organized around 100 anti-slavery conventions throughout the Northeast region of the United States. And in July of 1843, Collins was assigned to find Frederick Douglass, self-freed former slave, abolitionist, activist, writer, newspaper publisher, living in Rochester, New York at the time, to find a place so Collins was tasked to find a place for him to speak in the Syracuse, New York area. Unfortunately, Collins was unable to find a location for Frederick Douglass, and he ended up speaking at Fayette Park as a last resort. But it ended up being a historic event. Around 500 people eventually gathered. Douglass spoke, and then Collins spoke. And as Collins began to speak, Douglass became increasingly infuriated. He spoke of the narrow-mindedness of abolitionists and spoke instead on socialism, as opposed to wanting to abolish chattel slavery. John Collins believed that all forms of private property were a form of enslavement. So Douglass wrote to Collins's boss at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, Maria Weston Chapman, and called for his resignation in late summer of 1843. Next slide, please. Collins had to admit that his heart was no longer in the anti-slavery cause, believing that he had found the solution to all of society's problems, not just the chattel slavery problem. So he began to form the Skaneateles community in the fall of 1843 in Montville, New York, as I said. And he described it as a communist or communitist community. Maria Loomis, the editor of the Communitist newspaper, which was the newspaper printed at the Skaneateles community, described Collins's philosophy this way. Mr. Owen had all property in common. Mr. Collins proposes the same. Thus far, they go hand in hand, but they go no further. Not the least similarity can be discovered between them farther than this. So Collins's form of communism or communitism was maverick socialism. It was his own formulation. So next slide, please. So my article in the Communal Studies journal, the Communal Societies Journal, the Journal of the Communal Studies Association of the United States, argues for a historical materialist explanation of the movement for socialism in general and the Skaneateles community in particular. I argue that the market revolution led by the building of the Erie Canal, which was completed in 1825, led to a transformation in social and work life, which caused a reaction, and socialism was one of these reactions. Today, though, I want to take a different approach. Next slide, please. Next slide. So again, like I said, I take a more materialist economic approach. The Panic of 1837 was a crisis that caused many to turn to more radicalism. And it also caused a crisis in the abolitionist movement that led to radicalism in the abolitionist movement. Next slide. But today, due to the conference's theme and the fact that we're here at the Rudolf Steiner School, I wanted to take a little bit more of a Steinerite approach rather than a historical materialist approach. So anthroposophy has often been described as a syncretism between science and spirituality. So today I'm going to describe the Skaneateles community as a syncretic communist movement. These two traditions, syncretism and communism, were American traditions, and some of our international friends may, and also American people may be surprised to hear me describe communism as an American tradition, but we'll get into it later. But syncretism was certainly an American tradition having to do with the slave trade. We see evidence of the cosmogram from West Africa in colonial wear in 18th century South Carolina. Also, hoodoo was a religion that actually inspired the Underground Railroad and the spiritualist movement as well, African-American spiritualist movement. Next slide. So here I demonstrate the what's known as the triangular trade here, but this is a triangular cultural trade. So African-American spiritualism and hoodoo and things were inspired by the West African Bakongo priests in Congo and Angola, as well as English Protestantism and Spanish and French Catholicism. Next slide. So syncretism is a mixing, a blending of different ideas. The other American tradition that Collins took advantage of was communism. As I said, for post-Cold War people, it may be strange to hear communism being described as an American tradition, but Lewis Henry Morgan, the anthropologist from Rochester, New York, described the way of life of the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois as primitive communism. Today we might, in a more PC way, call it primary communism. And when the Shakers arrived in North America, they really believed that their system was in harmony with the communist system of the Iroquois. When the Shakers had visions in the gift period in the 1830s, they often spoke with dead Native Americans, Haudenosaunee, as well as Lewis Henry Morgan, and the spirit of Lewis Henry Morgan. So the Shakers were a clear link between Christianity, spiritualism, indigenous religion, and the American tradition of communism. Next slide, please. So the region that I'm from and the region that Collins chose to set up his community was known as the Burnt Over District. Collins moved from Massachusetts, he moved to Massachusetts in 1830 to attend Andover Theological Seminary, as many radicals at the time did. However, he eventually turned away from religion, but the Western New York was known as the Burnt Over District because of the Second Great Awakening movement led by itinerant minister Charles Finney from roughly 1825 to 1835. And the two theological contributions of the Second Great Awakening to American communism were perfectionism and millenarianism. Perfectionism being the idea that sin can be eliminated, or that perfection can be achieved here on earth, not in heaven, through elimination of sin. And then millenarianism, the belief that Jesus Christ will come back to the earth and reign for 1,000 years. Next slide, please. So here we see there's the Burnt Over District there in New York State, which, as I mentioned earlier, John Humphrey Noyes of the Oneida community called the Volcanic District of Fourierism. All right, next slide. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, but there have already been talks at this conference on some of the transatlantic religious communists who came from Europe early on. Many of them in the mid to late 18th century, and formed a basis for the communist tradition in the United States. Next slide. So here I just graphically illustrated the transatlantic movement of these religious communists. Okay, next slide, please. But as I said, John Collins was not a religious communist. In fact, he eschewed religion. And in 1842, he was one of the founders of the Society for Universal Inquiry and Reform, which was what was called a free thinkers society. Free thinkers were people that questioned orthodox religious doctrine. Many of them were religious themselves, but others were what were known as infidels, who didn't believe in God at all. Collins was among those that was one of the infidels. In his statement of articles of belief and disbelief and creed, that was published in the November 19th, 1843 Onondaga Standard newspaper, he said, the creed on which they stood was a disbelief in any special revelation of God to man, touching his will, and therefore binding upon man as authority in any arbitrary sense, that all forms of worship should cease, that all religions of every age and nation have their origin in the same falsehood vis-a-vis God's special providences. So Collins believed in the truth of Jesus' teachings, but he did not believe in their divine inspiration. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, Collins was inspired by Robert Owen, and Owen, like Collins, opposed private property. He was also an infidel, and a lot of the early news about the Owenite movement focused on his infidel beliefs rather than his communist beliefs. So Owen spoke before the United States Congress in 1824, saying the national mind must reject economic tyranny and embrace harmonious brotherhood. And so he formed the New Harmony community, which he bought from the religious communists, the Rapites, in the 1820s. Next slide. So here I demonstrate Robert Owen started in a textile mill in New Lanark, Scotland, and came to New and founded New Harmony in Indiana, USA in 1825. Next slide. Another big influence on Collins was, of course, William Lloyd Garrison, who was one of the founders of the Massachusetts anti-slavery movement. As I mentioned earlier, the Panic of 1837 was an economic depression, which also caused a corresponding panic in the abolitionist movement. Arthur Tappan was a textile manufacturer that was a big patron of Garrison and the Liberator newspaper and the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. And he experienced a real crash in his finances in 1837 and was no longer able to really support the anti-slavery movement as much as he did. And he led a walkout of people that were opposed to conservative abolitionists, that were opposed to women taking leadership roles in 1837. So loosed from Arthur Tappan's patronage, William Lloyd Garrison began to develop the concepts of no government and non-resistance. The belief was that government authority was not the answer, nor was violence. Collins agreed with this, and in June of 1844, he wrote, "Force begets force. There may be power in a bullet, but neither argument nor love follows its force. Touch not these governments, they oppress. They have their origin in oppression. Let the rich who need their protections do all the work and pay all the taxes. Touch not a ballot, it is a sheath sword. Attend no election, they are powder magazines." So the idea of no government, non-resistance was not to reject all institutions, but to build alternative institutions that were in line with God's plan. Next slide, please. So here we have, I'm just demonstrating Garrison's influence on Collins. Okay, next slide. Another Owenite that really influenced Collins was Fanny Wright and her Nashoba colony in Tennessee, which was the first to connect Owenite communism with abolitionism. It was founded in 1825 to purchase slaves at auction and attempted to educate them in self-reliance and communal living to prepare them for life as free people. But it failed by the end of the 1820s, and the abolitionist project did not really work out. Next slide. So like Owen, Fanny Wright was the daughter of a linen manufacturer and came from Scotland in 1818 and founded Nashoba in 1825. Next slide. Another influence was Charles Fourier. As I said, Western New York was the volcanic district of Fourierism. The Skaneateles community was founded during the peak of Fourierism in the volcanic district. And the Fourier Society of the city of Rochester was founded in 1843. Albert Brisbane, the prophet of Fourierism to the United States, was born in Batavia, New York, which is in this region. And Collins critiqued Fourierism, but he saw them as fellow travelers. He said Fourierism was a good school for communism, but disagreed with their individualistic ideas about passional attraction. Next slide. So we have Fourier from France influencing Albert Brisbane, who influenced the Fourierist movement in Western New York. Next slide. Another person who was involved in the Skaneateles community early on was Ernestine Rose. Ernestine Rose was born in Poland in 1810, the daughter of a rabbi. She traveled to the United States in May 1836 after meeting Robert Owen in England. She had lectured on slavery, religion, and women's rights. And she and her husband intended to move to the Skaneateles community. And she spoke at the founding convention in 1823. However, she disagreed with them over the issue of a deed. Rose believed they should have a deed. Collins was opposed. And there ultimately was a compromise over the deed. They put everybody in the community in the deed. which led to loopholes for lawyers and others to make off with a lot of the community's property, which set them back. So next slide. So there's Rose coming from Poland in 1843 or 1836, and her association with the Skaneateles community. Next slide. I won't talk extensively on this, but this was another sort of pseudo-Fourierist institution, Northampton Association for Education and Industry in Massachusetts. It was founded by silk manufacturers who were victims of the Panic of 1837. And significantly, the abolitionist Sojourner Truth and David Riggles lived at that community. Next slide. So there we have Northampton in Massachusetts influencing Collins in New York. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, ultimately they did lose a great deal of their land due to the loopholes in the deed. In 1845, they attempted to incorporate as a corporation so they could do business in New York State, but the New York State legislature refused. And after that, they only lasted another 9 months into 1846. The Utopian chronicler, A.J. McDonald, said the experiment did not fail through pecuniary embarrassment. The property was worth twice as much when the community dissolved as it was at first, and was much more than sufficient to pay all debts. The Skaneateles community member Sam Sellers wrote to Mary Weston Chapman again in 1846 to try and get Collins his job as an anti-slavery agent back without Collins's knowledge, actually. And he said to Mary Weston Chapman, the community enterprise he has got through with and has abandoned, principle and practice. He is out of money, out of excuse, out of business, out of credit, to some extent out of spirit and out of breath, out of elbows, out and quite roughly everything but of difficulties. So Collins moved west to California and became a self-concerned businessman. However, he supported the Republican Party in 1856 in the lead up to the Civil War. Next slide. And there's just a few more pictures of the grounds. Some of them are from Arthur Bester's research in the 1940s, and then some of them are my own pictures of the site today. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mitch. Our next presenters are Damien and Samira Rousseliere.
I present directly. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm switching places with
Yeah.
Damien.
Okay. Thanks, Mitch. Okay. 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 Do you hear me online? Is it okay? Okay, thanks. So thank you very much. I will present our paper co-authored with Samira Rousseliere, who is an associate professor of management at ONIRIS, which is the National School of Veterinary Medicine in France. I am professor of economics at the National Institute of Agricultural Sciences in Angers and Rennes in France, and I am also a member of the board of the French Association for Fourierist Studies, which is the only academic association which study the legacy of Fourier. There are some change with if you compare with the abstract in the program. We have changed the presentation. At the beginning, we want to focus on because with Samira, we have a research program on the question of the sustainable production of alcohol in collective organization and so on. but we have to postpone a research stay in America. So the idea is the presentation is a step back. I will present more the framework, the objective of our research program on of the international community of the 19th century. But if we have time, I have two bonus about two Icarian beer recipes I found in the archive in Iowa and in Detroit. So the main question is what remains of the 19 American Utopian Communes. I see online there's Juliana Frost. Juliana wrote a nice article about the Columbia Phalanx, phalanx which disappeared with no trace remaining. You know, most of you may know the Don Johnson collection at the University of Southern Indiana. For example, the phalanx I will talk about is the Philadelphia in Michigan and the only fields. And actually, it's very, very poetic photo because at the foreground you see Yao, Achillea millephonium, which is one of the most powerful plants which heal, I would say, anything. So, and we have also some psychotropic effect, by the way. What remains of 19 American Utopian Communes, like Phalanx, it remains only landmarks in the crossroads. For example, in New Jersey for the North American Phalanx, or the Lagrange Phalanx in the Midwest. With a colleague at the University of Minnesota, Avner Benner, we try to address this famous question of the life duration for intentional communities based on the famous directory on the 19th century communities made by Don Pitzer, Oved, and used by James Keats or Richard Saucis. There's a huge difference in the life duration of international community. On average, is 21 years. But if you compare between religious and secular international communities, this is just the estimation of the survival probability for a given community. For example, here you have the probability for given religious international community created in the 19th century to survive at least 20 years. The probability is only 50%. But if you compare with a secular intentional community, this probability is about 5 to 10%. So, and of course, because some religious international community can be democratic and some socialist community can be not democratic, we estimate the same function, and you have also the same result that authoritarian international community have a higher probability to survive than non-authoritarian international community. So that is one of the classical questions addressed by Ross Cantor in his famous book, for example. And of course, the question is for socialist utopian communities, is disappearance really a failure? And there is a paradox based on a democratic dissensus in the socialist and democratic society, because you're supposed to have the member consent, whereas in religious and authoritarian community, you may not need this consent. So different paper try to, and book, and more recently by Amy Hart, try to address this question. Of course, the approach from Don Pitzer. So the idea is to approach this paradox with another perspective. As an economist, we try to address this question by a microeconomic approach to the ordinary economic life in these communities. As commitment is the main issue in this community, the question is how to allocate skills and labor with efficiency while taking into account individual freedom and collective interest without the subordination power. This famous question in the kibbutzim, and we want to address the question of how members react. Do they choose to stay or exist? And of course, there is a commitment that allows membership to be maintained, but this commitment may disappear as there is a discrepancy between values and practices in the communities. So we focus mainly on the archive of specific community, the Icarian movement, and some phalanxes in the Midwest, and we have a look at all the accounting document, the mode of remuneration, and other document. So there's a paper to be published in the journal American Communist History. There's two paper in French and a work in progress on another phalanx in Colorado. So we have access to primary archive at the French Icarian Village Foundation, the University of Michigan, but there's a letter, Icarian letter all around the world. We have from Amsterdam to San Francisco. So just maybe two short elements about the American phalanxes, but Mitch already said something about Fourier. So of course there's the famous boom and bust creation of the phalanxes during the early 40s of the 19th century, and with propagandists and founders Brisbane and Greeley, and also with boundary issue with the Northampton Association is that have some phalanx dimension, but other dimension, Oneida and so on. The Icarian movement is maybe not so known by scholar. About 2,000 to 3,000 French immigrants come to America during the mid 19th century. They create at first a phalanx community in Texas, but because of the terrible weather, the community moved to Illinois, to Nauvoo, just after the Mormons went out the city, and there was a split between two branches in the Nauvoo Icarian society. One go to Missouri, the other go to Iowa, and after 20 years, there are also another split between the young branch and the old branch. The young branch move eventually to California, to Cloverdale, California. So there is different origins. The Icarian movement is really based on the French immigration, whereas the Alphadelphia or the phalanxes is the second and third generation of immigrants, breeders of Brisbane. They are mainly local farmers, whereas in the Icarian movement, it's mainly urban, educated classes with different view about Christianism and communism between Icaria and phalanxes. But they share some characteristic. They are mainly agricultural based community. 3,000 acres is a is a huge large farm at the at the period. They are highly diversified farms with animal production, cattle, winery, orchards, vegetable, and so on. And they share the same structure with a collective housing in the middle of the community, palais social for the phalanxes, or the réfectoire, the dining hall for the Icarian movement, with all the individual houses around the dining hall, the bakery, and all the bâtiment dedicated to economic production. So we focus on the accounting document in this community. Just a crash course on accounting. The classical business bookkeeping is you have a day book, a journal, and inventory. I would say maybe it's what we do for our personal finance. And for enterprise, you have also a ledger, a balance sheet, and an income statement. Of this day book, journal, and inventory is really a family account system. It's something you have to do if you want to manage your own wealth, your personal expenses and revenue. But for a business, for an enterprise, you need to have also a balance sheet, which is a view, which give you a broad view on the asset and the liabilities of the wealth of your community at a specific moment in time, and the income statement in order to assess the profitability of various activities. But you can also have analytical accounting, a shareholders book, like in any incorporated company, individuals accounts. Because, for example, in a Phalanx or in a New Harmony, in a Roberto Wayne New Harmony, you have individual accounts because you have to pay the community for services, and on the other hand, the community give you wages for your labor or dividend for your share in the community. You can also have records of daily production by branches, and social accounting, the records of labor. Okay, so yeah, just an example, income statement for here you have $3 for selling cheese. For example, record of labor performed by the members of the Phalanx. So Luc Keefe, who was the founder of Philadelphia, for example, worked about 700 hours for in 6 months of the day book. So if you compare the Icarian movement and the phalanxes, you have on one end an accounting system of family farm, and on the other end a very complex system. Maybe some you know the book from Bester, Backwoods Utopia, about Owenite organization. It's the Robert Owen New Harmony is really the same system of accounting system. And there's two remuneration models. Icaria, there's no wage or remuneration. The community provides members with supplies and services free of charge. There's a vote on all the expenses. I have access to 20 years of general minutes of the minutes of the general assemblies of the Icarian movement. And there, I would say there's 1,000 of micro decisions on travel and so on. And on the other hand, for phalanxes, you have private production. The allocation of work is decided by the Committee of Labor, and there may be the wage may be weighted according to various elements. So just to maybe in 3 minutes, just to finish on this element, in Icaria, which lasts about 50 years, one of the main reasons is about the use of surplus in the community. The surplus, the benefit, were used for collective investment in order to increase quality of life and economic production. Whereas in Philadelphia, they share all these surplus only for wages and dividends. And of course, there's been a problem because the bylaws of the phalanx forbid debts. So the only solution to invest was to increase the number of shareholders. And the dividend decrease, so less external shareholders are interested. And on the other hand, most of the internal shareholders are credited with shares for the possession they brought into the phalanx. And most of them are totally useless. For example, your Henry Hall, in exchange of a share, bring a coffee pot, 38 cents, a lot of knives and forks, 100, and there's a bunch of things like that. So of course, the phalanx was fast running out of cash in 4 years. So I will skip all this about conflict resolution, and just to my conclusion. And there's if we compare Icaria movement and phalanxes, there's one of the main reasons we have to redefine exit from an international community. Exit become more likely as there's a decrease in loyalty. There's an increase in the external opportunity. For example, the capability for a French-speaking immigrant to have a job in the neighborhood, and as international sanctions become less credible. And we know in the literature that there are 2 types of exit. One is because of is brain drain. For example, the book from Ron Abraminski on the kibbutz about the disappointment about the economic results, and the other is the behaving because of the disappointment about the social issue. And this may lead to the redefinition of the impact of the success of the international community, because the exit for economic reasons, people who exit the community for economic reasons may have a huge impact on the local economic development. The orchard production in Iowa, the wine industry in California, for example, and the people who left the community for social reason may have huge impact on the development of community, for example, liberal in Missouri, the social movement in America, the member of the Icarian movement were founders of the Socialist Party of America, for example. So thank you, and sorry for being too long. So this is the receipt, for example.
Thank you, Damien. And our final speaker today is Csaba.
All right. Does the microphone work? It does. And is Libby waiting for us? Okay. Oh, I think. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Libby. My name is Csaba Toth, and I'm a professor of history at Carlow University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and my main field of research is, utopian social movements. And so, if I want to make a very simplistic distinction, okay, between like communal studies and say utopian studies, I would say that we on the utopian side are more interested, in the possibilities of total social transformation, while those involved in communal studies want probably the same thing, but through a molecular advance. Now, my talk here today is about a very famous strike in Marquis Rocks in 1909, and the way it kind of connects to what we have been doing here in the past 3-4 days is, how whatever happens, okay, in the course of the strike impacts the community. All right, often tend to forget about the strikers' wives, children, etc., and their social conditions, and on the other hand, how this particular community, familial community, empowers most of the time, okay, those in labor action. So so again, the strike was in 1909 at the Pressed Steel Company in Marquis Rocks, Pennsylvania, and the economic cause of the strike was immediate. Cause of the strike was the introduction of the pooling system of wages. Okay? What is it? This system, okay, which replaced the previous piecework arrangement, meant that all man's earnings on the assembly line were pooled and divided equally. That is, if one man or one group of men was slow, the weekly earnings of all workers were reduced. So this impacted almost exclusively unskilled, immigrant labor. Okay, all right, okay. Libby, okay, why don't we go to the next slide? All right, so this is the real story. And anyway, so the introduction of the pooling system, which, the piecework in itself, sounds awful, but the pooling system, okay, kind of outdid it in its, awfulness. So if you, Michael, Mitch, okay, if you Mitch were a little bit slower, okay, then all of us, okay, then we were punished because of your slowness. So so what's the solution? Okay, we put enormous pressure on you, okay, all right. So it's a perfect way of playing workers out against workers. Now, very important about this strike at Marquis Rocks was that it was victorious. Okay? Now, there are not too many victorious strikes in the time period, especially not on the scale of what was going on here in Pennsylvania. And the strike went on for 50 days, okay, which meaning thousands of workers on strike, families without income, some of whom were evicted. So 50 days can be sometimes a day in life can be too long, but 50 days under the circumstances terrible. So another significant feature of the strike was that this was perhaps the first time that immigrant, unskilled or semi-skilled labor joined forces with the American skilled labor. So American skilled labor was typically steps above immigrant, unskilled labor, both in terms of payment, how those guys were dealt with, etc., etc. Now, can we go to the next slide? So this is where the strike took place. Okay, this is the Press Steel Company contemporary photograph. It's huge. Okay, but I visited just prior to coming over here, visited Marquis Rocks, and not much is left of this, enormous, factory complex. I mean, I would say pretty much nothing. Okay, so all this is gone, and some remnants of the walls separating the factory, the gigantic factory yard, from the settlement. Are still there. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so I mean these are the houses that most of the workers and their families lived at, and they don't seem to be that bad. Okay, from a certain perspective, but based on all the descriptions. It was like, and also if you look at the photo closely, almost all of these houses are boarded up, so which kind of tells you, that in the present time, things are not a hell of a lot better, than used to be back, in 1909. Next slide, please. Okay. This is, again, like a survivor from that era, a tenement, and again, so you have to imagine here like tons of kids, boarders, families, etc., on top of each other. No, only outhouses, if at all, right, and in tough conditions. Okay, next slide. Okay. One more, and this one is again like a segment of a street in Marquis Rocks, and significantly, I mean, if you look at the photograph, the only person who you see, in this area is, an African American woman and leading or holding, her child. So really, the going there is being there is not the most luxurious. It doesn't give you luxurious feeling. So you can buy a house there, for $35,000, which is. All right. Okay, so the Trautmann and the IWW and the strike. Trautmann, William E. Trautmann comes into this picture, and the next slide, please. Get used to this. So William E. Trautmann comes into this picture as the writer of the definitive fictional rendering of the strike, called, book was named Riot, okay? And the original title, Hammers of Hell, but for marketing reasons, okay, it metamorphosed itself into Riot. And Trautmann is a famous guy, one of the founders of the IWW. Sure, most of you know what that was. Important union in the early 1900s. Okay, and the difference between the unions of an earlier period was that those were craft unions, while the IWW, okay, tried to organize, along industrial lines, meaning that whether you were a welder or carpenter, in the same factory, you were in the same union, industrial workers of the world. Okay, so this guy Trautmann was born in New Zealand, grew up in Germany and Poland, and in these countries he was trained as a brewer, and as such, immigrated to America in 1890, and once he's here and goes through the challenges of being in the United Brewers Association, right? Switches to more challenging and more comprehensive union position in the IWW, and as such, he was sent by the IWW, okay, to the strikers at the Preston Steel Company as the chief organizer. So, and he was there for a few weeks before he got arrested, but those few weeks were, gave him enough chance to get a pretty good picture of what was going on. So another important thing that I'm noting here about the Marquis Rock strike was that, once a strike succeeds, okay, then the next strike, wow, okay, those guys could pull it off. So it really became a prelude, okay, to and model for other somewhat laterish victorious strikes. Okay. Okay. I mean, we are at slide 6 or 7. Okay, so patience. Okay, but I mean, it's good that you are pumped up. All right, so 1909, the book comes out in 1922, and it's written by Trautmann at around that time, 13 years later. Now, 13 years is a long time, and he really became from an original syndicalist into something else, okay, like into some purist, labor organizer, okay, and as we will see, distanced himself from the UBW, that's the United Brewery Workers, the AFL, what that is, okay, and the more radical wing of the IWW, because they split, okay, and that was the less radical wing of the IWW, the Chicago wing, which actually valorized political action. And Trautmann, okay, by before at the beginning of the World War I, said that no political action, okay, it's strikes, okay, that will bring about change it. And you need something, and so he finds it in the shape and form and meaning of the Soviet. Okay, so that's the Soviet plays a relatively important role as a new thing, in the book, and we will, a little bit later talk about what exactly was meant by Soviet and in the time period, and especially once it comes to America, things can change. But before in the book, and now I'm talking about the book. Okay, in the book, before he gets onto the story, okay, reviews the role of all the major players, are they divided left, and again, so in this particular context, his judgment is rather negative. All right, next, please. Next slide. Okay, good, great. Here now, the story is told through the eyes of a young Polish guy. It's kind of a Bildungsroman in some ways. Okay, Václav, who basically from a innocent-eyed immigrant working class boy, okay, becomes by the end of the book, a radicalized, class-conscious worker. Now, the conditions, okay, at the press steel company were, terrible. The conditions in the industrial village surrounding the company were terrible. We will see why. And so there is an organization, and this is, it's the real story and the fictional story often overlap. So maybe under different names, but there is a secret organization called the Pioneers. Okay, and this is in the book. And the Pioneers are a group of ethnically diverse workers. If you look at the list, okay, you see that these guys are immigrant workers, which also means that most of them are unskilled, and the loudest ones of this group is the refugees from the 1905 Russian Revolution, and some fellow countrymen of mine, okay, some Hungarians, okay, who are like the loudest in terms of wanting some confrontation. Now, again, 1922, so we are in Trautmann's less and less radical stage, of his political career, and he clearly, unlike before World War I, he clearly rejects revolution, and the especially the usual thing against revolution is violence. Okay, we don't want violence, and he's Václav's mentor. So the young Polish boy's mentor, Mike Murphy, an elderly, high-paid role male master who was hanged as a Molly Maguire a couple of decades earlier, earlier than that, says, okay, violence is the best method to keep tyrants in the saddle. Okay, only retards, violence only retards real progress. And well, actually, on a footnote to this, this story made me read the Sir Conan Doyle, okay, the Sherlock Holmes guy. He has a very interesting book about. All right, he has a very interesting book about the Molly Maguires, and one of those actually really interesting books where he looks at the interconnections, okay, between the kind of political terrorism, if you like, in the UK and in America. So, right. Okay. Let's see the Hunky Town. So that's next. Next slide, please. Okay. Next slide. Okay. Next slide. All right, so this is the communities, named Hunky Town, slum area. We have, some upper class visitors there. Talked, okay, you are jesting. Okay, those are not intended to be lodgings. These things look like large boxes or coffins. What do we see there? I mean, it's the what you would find in a slum. Okay, a drunken man. It's playing in the dirt, okay, with pigs and dogs. In fact, I mean, there are some harrowing scenes where kids and dogs, okay, fight for the same chunk of meat. Women are just there, okay, they don't care about the kids. And the way you can figure out, okay, which it's very segregated. Hunky Town. The way you can figure out where the Slovaks are or where the Czechs or the Hungarians is through the smell of food. Okay, so when you smell right, okay, then you know that that's where we have the Serbs and Slovaks, Hungarians, etc., etc. Now, no matter how shitty the environment is, the rent was high, okay, $12 a month, and you have to understand this $12 in the context of a worker having to work for 120 hours for earning $13.85. Graft was pervasive. Graft meant, pretty much, I wanted some cash, okay? I fired Mitch, okay? And you paid me, okay? Typically $20, okay? Typically $20. Okay, good. Okay, we never got to well, okay, during the conversation, right? And if you didn't have cash, okay, if you didn't have cash, you could offer your wife or your daughter, okay, to me, and that guaranteed you a job, maybe not for too long. So it's. Okay, good.
And she's been dying to ask. No, you're done? Okay. Okay, go ahead, Haran. I'll repeat it for the Zoom audience.
Even though the component is not falling apart, was this just a relation today, or did they have like this professional? Did it have long-lasting impact on the country?
I'm just going to repeat this question for the Zoom audience. So Haran was asking if the 19th century communities were just kind of a blip in the American history, or whether they had a long-term impact.
Yeah, they were absolutely short-lived. Most of them, a lot of them around 3 years, or maybe 4 max. As far as long-ranging impact, well, a lot of them left a sour taste in people's mouth for socialism, and so there was a reaction to that. But also, a
a lot of the Fourierists, Horace Greeley in particular, became leaders in the Republican Party once the Republican Party was founded in the 1850s. And then many of them also joined in the Union Army during the Civil War, and later became, radical Republicans advocating Reconstruction in the South to transition away from slavery. Unfortunately, that didn't last long either, and the Compromise of 1877 basically ended that project. But the shift, as I see it, was away from an idea of harmony between classes and moral suasion as a technique to class struggle and violence as the technique. And so I think there was a real shift there after the failure of these communities in the 1850s. And then that led up to the Civil War.
Because they failed, people resorted to violence, or another way?
Yeah, so because they failed, there was a rejection of socialism broadly. And a lot of the Fourierists and a lot of these other, what you might call utopian socialists, believed that the bosses and the workers should get along together. And so the socialists that came after, many of them actually coming from Germany as a result of the revolutions of 1848 against the Prussian Empire. Many of them were Marxist. And so instead of this idea of harmony between capital and labor, they believed in class struggle. And then the moral suasion idea, as it became more and more clear that slave owners weren't going to voluntarily give up their slaves, the abolitionists moved from this idea that you can influence people by appealing to their religion and appealing to their morality to an idea of that state violence was necessary.
But it proved that this path doesn't work. That's possible.
Yeah, in a way, I would say, and there was, like the Mormons, they started in Western New York, and then they were thrown out of Western New York because of their strange ideas, and then when the Oneida community formed, the leader of the Oneida community also fled from New York in that region. And many of the Fourierists said there was a sour taste left in people's mouth about that. But a lot of those people actually moved out west and sort of following the Mormon example. And actually, Horace Greeley was the one who said, "Go west, young man."
Damien also wants to respond.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to add something too. There were
just to say that
go ahead.
Mitch has a point here. There's only one mention of utopian socialist society in the book from Howard Zinn, The People History of the USA. Only one mention about Csaba and Fanny Wright. So there's a split between the history of utopian community and the legacy. The recent book from Amy Hart addressed the legacy of the Fourierism about the right of women and so on. But the legacy is very tiny.
I was just going to add, there were a number of 19th century communities that endured for 100 years or more. And looking at Donald Pitzer's theory of developmental communalism, a lot of people went from one community to another or to other reform movements, including the unions and abolition and a number of other things. So they did definitely have an influence in educating people about these egalitarian ideas and about challenging industrial capitalism. So just because a particular community might not have lasted long, it didn't mean it didn't have an influence.
The ideas can endure.
Yeah, yeah,
Even though the abolitionism is the movement to abolish slavery.
that's correct. Yes. So we have,
You mentioned that, some of these communitarian movements, lived as long as 100 years. Need it?
We just have one question online.
All right. Okay. Good. So those are mostly or almost exclusively, the religious communitarians. So when there was like a strong ideological cohesion, within a community, like Shakers. Okay, you guys are going to go to visit the Shakers, in Canterbury, this fall. So they have been around for 150 years at least, and for some reason, we say it's like these small communities, socialists, etc. It was probably true of the leaders, or the most intimate disciples of these leaders, like Victor Considerant and some of these others, but most people joined these communities out of pragmatic purposes. Okay? So I'm there on the frontier, whatever that was. It's nice, to find 1,000 people there doing, giving me home, etc. That's kind of a problem, I think, and I'm not talking about the kibbutzim, but in a lot of other places in the world, that people use communes as a stepping stone or finding company or God knows what, but there is no ideological. And when I say ideological, I also mean religion. That's kind of an ideology. So that kind of cohesion is missing. That dooms the enterprise.
So we do have a question online. I can read that out.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure. So from Juliana, this is a question for Damien. In your work on Alphadelphia, did you explore its connections to the Universalist faith?
No, not yet. But just to say that I have a presentation, and there is a huge difference between Fourierism, as we know it in France, and the version made by Brisbane in the US. Because I made this presentation about Alphadelphia at a previous assembly of the Association d'études Fourieristes, and there was René Scherer. René Scherer is one of the most famous French writer on. He's about 99 years old, about Fourier, militant of the gay movement. He was the partner of Guy Oppenheim during the May 68, and René Scherer was conceived Fourierist as we say sex liberator, and family. You have to show you can have all the partner you want, any gender and so on, in the phalanx there. But for when you see what became Fourierism in the US, it's more I would say a social Christian approach to socialism. So, and in effect, in Alphadelphia, they were reverent, and some connection about the universalist faith that I did not work on. So,
hey, Betsy had a question.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. My question relates to the division of labor and compensation around women's labor, men's labor, and who benefited from the community's freedoms. In what sense were women, in these communities economically empowered in any way, especially married women, since at the time the property and rights of women were barely above, I mean, they were very encumbered. And of course, yeah, and I say this as someone who looked at the current crop in the FIC directory, and one conclusion I said is, well, we seem to have worked out the equality among men and women in terms of division of leadership and participation. So, but I was talking on a very superficial level. So I'd be interested in your dystopia, in your economic analysis, and in these communities you studied. To what extent were women economically equal, especially married women?
So I mentioned Ernestine Rose, as well as briefly mentioned Maria Loomis, but Maria Loomis was the editor of the Communist magazine for several years, and had a leadership position in the community. But Ernestine Rose, one of the reasons she ultimately decided not to join the community is that she visited it like a year or so later and said most of the women were doing all the domestic work, doing double shifts, so to speak, despite the fact that Collins, the year prior, had written an editorial arguing that men should do the domestic work. So, so there was, and also in terms of voting, in terms of work, in terms of compensation, if they were to leave, women were absolutely seen as equal. Unfortunately, however, in practice, it maybe didn't always work out that way. And that was part of Ernestine Rose's critique.
And I think it also was a class-inflected issue, that what women, should have divided work or with men, etc., etc. That was possible in a middle class, environment. I mean, let's so say, in my case, where the men work 16 hours, and under the most, the parts of the factory were called the slaughterhouse, where the crane operators, kind of higher stratum of labor, were playing games like dropping heavy metal on unskilled labor. Okay. And
the would be more the utopian response to dystopian reality.
Yeah, I mean, back to, and let me answer her question, okay, in a sentence. So the victory, I mean, the victory was meant for a few years at least, that workers, had a say, in wages, hours, okay, the length of the work day, and certain safety measures. But when Trautmann goes back to the same factory in 1913, most of these things, okay, have been, yeah. And so, but the Soviet, at least as a transitional mode, called for precisely these things, okay, rather than workers' management of production. So even, I mean, Lenin in 1917 is, we don't want that, okay, because you and I don't know anything about the factory, so we have to keep those bourgeois managers, okay, in place to survive. And this led to many conflicts.
Just in the Phalanx study, this is very different from the Northampton Association, the Wisconsin Phalanx, the North American Phalanx. We were studied by Amy Hart. There's all the women were excluded from the economic and political decision, and there was a discrimination about the wages. They paid about half of the wages of the men, the situation. So, but this question was addressed in the book by Amy. So, in the Icarian movement, there was a change during the time period, especially when there were new members coming from the Commune de Paris in the 80s, 70s, with more libertarian mind and liberal mind, and that was the beginning of a conflict in the community, and the young community, the young people create a new community in which women and men were equal, but it forced also the old community to change the political right and the business right for women. So at the end, there was maybe you know the book from Diana Garneau about Citoyenne and Icaria, and she wrote a lot about this, about how the women take power also in the old Icarian society. So it's very interesting for that.
Yeah, I want to mention too, the burnt over district of the Second Great Awakening became the hotbed of suffragist activity. And one of the reasons for that was that during the Second Great Awakening, women were able to be leaders in the church. They couldn't be priests necessarily, but they could be prayer leaders and choir leaders and things like that. And a lot of in Rochester, I study the Fourierist movement in Rochester too. And a lot of the leaders of the Fourierist movement in Rochester, such as Sarah Fish and her daughter, Catherine Stebbins Fish, and then and Huldah Anthony, they were at the Seneca Falls Convention and big activists in the suffrage movement as well, and friends with Amy Post, who was a famous abolitionist and suffragist from Rochester too. And Huldah Anthony was a relative. She was like a, great aunt or something of Susan B. Anthony. So they were actually related by blood.
Any more questions from the Zoom audience? Nothing? Any more questions in the room? All right, then let's thank our speakers and our tech team. And thank you for the audience for having the stamina to carry through to this last session.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for, doing the moderating,